I now look to Dominic Brind, Deputy Returning Officer, Magdalen College, to continue the case for the opposition.
Over the last few years, I've seen nothing but leaders who prioritise their own survival and private ambitions over any sense of principle. A complete lack of transparency about how deals are made, an extremely questionable use of patronage, and what we might well deem toxic politics. Frankly, one wonders where Theresa May would be if she hadn't learnt her trade as the returning officer at the Oxford Union. When Donald Tusk talked of a special place in hell for Brexiteers who convinced the country to vote leave despite having no credible plan, he might well have been thinking of this institution. It is an honour to be here and to be speaking here tonight, and I'd like to thank everyone. I never said that the lack of principle didn't extend to me. It's an honour, though, to be speaking here tonight, and I'd like to thank everyone who's put this debate and this term together. It is truly an honour to have been part of this institution alongside you. I'd like to thank Amber and James, who are truly a logistical powerhouse. Frankly, I can think of no one who I would rather have strutting around Dover at 11 p.m. on the 29th of March in high-vis jacket, desperately trying to organise queues of lorries. No one could do it better than you. Nick as well, if you can keep up with minuting the standing committee meetings we've seen this term, I'm sure you could certainly cope with the Cabinet when they actually get round to discussing Brexit. I'm going to be very honest with you. I never thought that I would be debating alongside Nigel Farage. It truly shows how I'll be showing later in my speech that Brexit has truly upended our politics, and this deal is no way to end that. It's also perhaps less surprising that I'm speaking alongside Andrew. I'm very impressed by the tireless energy he has poured into campaigning around the country. Truly, he is fired by the spirit akin to that of an HS2 train, ploughing through the English countryside, ripping up the Chilterns. He is an inspiration to us all. Even if one does suspect he's more into this for the trains than for the politics. Some might say that speaking on this side, we have an alliance of extremes, unable to accept a moderate, sensible compromise deal, as I'm sure Rory will very eloquently say, and Henry and Amber have said very well. But the reality is that this deal leaves no one happy. And that's because it doesn't implement any possible way you could implement the mandate of the referendum. I agree with James that there is no will of the people, but this deal satisfies no potential will of the people you could possibly envisage or possibly imagine could come to fruition as part of policy. Ultimately, this deal getting through would poison British politics for a generation. I'm going to be talking about three things. Firstly, I'm talking about how this is not, in fact, a deal, and what, in fact, we have on the table, as Andrew mentioned, with the political declaration. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why this is no excuse for moderate compromise, and that's a disingenuous way of framing what we have on the table. And thirdly, I want to talk about what I call the grayling effect, and how Brexit is mucking up the rest of our politics and leading to extreme mediocrity becoming embedded across government, leaving us unable to tackle the actual challenges that we're facing. So, on to my first point. We've heard from the proposition that Brexit is chaotic and divisive, and that people just want to move on. But this deal does not do that. Frankly, this is what we should have come to expect from the current government. This is the current government that brought us £20 million of government money going to a ferry company with no boats. It's a strong and stable election campaign that lost the government their majority, and an inability to successfully bribe a party of 8 MPs with £1 billion of taxpayers' money. And so given that, what we've ended up with is a deal that is not a deal that does not actually solve the future problems of our relationship with the EU, instead storing up troubles and further kicking the can down the road, which has been the most damaging aspect of the Brexit process so far. And let's, in particular, compare the deal that we have on the table to the deal that we were promised in 2016. Michael Gove said, "The day after we vote to leave, we hold all the cards and we can choose the path we want." The mendacity didn't just stop on referendum day. In 2017, Liam Fox talked about how coming to a free trade agreement with the EU should be one of the easiest in human history. That was referring to the future trade agreement that we haven't even started on. Theresa May in October 17 talked about how the point of the implementation period is to put in place the practical changes necessary to move to the future partnership. And for that, you need to know what the future partnership is going to be. Unfortunately, we don't. I could go on. I could have an entire speech made up of the quotes showing the mendacity of Brexiters, how they've lied and misrepresented what is actually on the table. Instead, I'm going to talk about what is actually wrong with this deal. So what does this deal actually do? As Henry said very eloquently, it gets us out and into a transition period. It ties up a lot of loose ends. Lots of the technocratic, nitty-gritty aspects of withdrawal it deals with very well. The backstop, I would agree, is probably the best part of the deal, safeguarding the future and the young people of Northern Ireland growing up in a generation of the peace process. But what's crucial is that there's no detail on the actual future relationship. That's what everyone talked about when they talked about a deal. That's what Theresa May talked about when she talked about a bad deal, a no deal being better than the bad deal. It's just not in there. Similarly, when Henry was talking about how we take back control of services, that control is a synonym for losing access and having a worse access to our main services export market of the EU. It's ultimately a ridiculous situation. MPs are being asked to just get us out with no detail of what Brexit actually looks like. And crucially, it means that when we see what our future relationship with the EU will be like, it will be too late to change it. So what do we have? We have this 26-page document. It's a cracking read. It's the political declaration setting out the framework for the future relationship between the European Union and the United Kingdom. But what is inside this document is laughably vague. Let's look at paragraph 15, for example. In addition, the parties note the United Kingdom's intention to explore options for a future relationship with the European Investment Bank Group. Now, I'm sorry, but intention to explore options being noted is just not good enough. Let's look at paragraph 117 on counter-terrorism work. The parties should cooperate. Again, should is not enough for the people whose lives depend on effective policing work. Indeed, if we look at my favourite clause, paragraph number 107, this deals with space arrangement, and it simply reads, the parties should consider appropriate arrangements for cooperation on space. Again, this document is not worth the paper that it is printed on. It is... Here you go, Amber. Have a read. Ultimately, what this means is that we get out under the main text of withdrawal agreement, an even spicier read, I can assure you. And we get out, but then we have even less leverage than we do now. What we end up with is a ticking clock of the transition period. This is demonstrably worse than the Article 50 period because there's even less of a mechanism to extend it. And furthermore, we have none of the paltry leverage that we get at the moment as still a member. What's especially laughable is the fact that it is the same government that has consistently failed to deliver on any policy, and especially on Brexit, is now imploring us just to trust them to sort out the details later. Two reasons this is particularly awful. The first is that we get no closure. You might think that this deal, and indeed the proposition are going to claim that this deal allows us to bundle up Brexit and just deal with it and move on. But that's just wrong. We will still be obsessing over customs and quotas and tariffs and tolls for years. Ultimately, I don't want to spend my entire adult life arguing about Brexit. The last 2 years have been enough already. You might think that this deal represents the white smoke on Brexit, but really, that's just Nigel puffing away in the corner. But secondly, if you're worried about no deal, this also isn't a way to avoid it. Given the government's track record, it's highly likely that we could end up with no deal at the end of all this, with no sovereignty or control or ability to alter our situation. So we would end up in the backstop, which would leave us politically devoid of influence or power. Ultimately, that is not a pragmatic course of action. Secondly, let's talk about why this is not a compromise. I think, on a theoretical level, if we were presented with a deal, let's say the day after she became Prime Minister, Theresa May talked about how she wanted to unite the country together, to bring people together to have a common solution that pleased everyone. Then that might be a deal that Remainers like myself and Andrew could get behind. But that's not what this is. This is so far from a compromise. I think James and Andrew have done a very compelling job of showing why it's a rubbish deal, but it's not even rubbish born out of a will to compromise. Because at every stage, Theresa May's government has shown a compulsive wish to avoid compromising or reaching out to any opponents. I think it's very telling that after her deal was defeated by a historic margin, her first reaction was not to talk to the opposition parties, but rather to close ranks and try and get a few more votes from the restive ERG. Ultimately, this is a Prime Minister who's brought in a wonderful era of collaborative and consensual politics. We've had hits like Citizens of Nowhere to describe EU migrants and people who opposed her Little England view of Britain. We've had Crush the Saboteurs being the battle cry of her snap election. We've had the language of treachery and betrayal and enemies of the people directed at MPs, civil society and judges who didn't toe her line. Proponents of the people's vote have been accused of talking Britain down and strengthening the EU's hand in a treacherous manner. Today, in Grimsby, the Prime Minister turned her scorn on the EU and blamed them for if there were to be a no-deal outcome. Ultimately, Theresa May is already planning who to blame when her own catastrophic Brexit comes home to roost. Ultimately, the reason that this deal is such a mess is it's trying to square Theresa May's own red lines with reality. It's trying to maintain some economic ties whilst maintaining her dogmatic opposition to free movement. It's trying to get the farthest possible distance from the EU while maintaining a hard border in Northern Ireland. It's trying to stay as close as possible to the EU while still leaving the single market. These contradictory impulses mean that this is not a deal that can stand up to reality. So I agree with Nigel in many ways, and all those other Brexits pointing out how this deal doesn't even deliver on the referendum result. It would make our NHS weaker, it would leave us poorer, and it would leave us less sovereign, which were, however way you want to spin the EU referendum, very key reasons why people voted leave. Ultimately, it is an achievement in unity for bringing people together through its sheer unpopularity. When you have Nigel Farage and Andrew Dominic speaking on the same side, that is the only form of unity that Theresa May has managed to get. Finally, I want to talk about how this deal has mucked up our politics, or as we might term it, the life and times of Christopher Grayling. So I'd like to say that incompetent ministers are nothing new, but under Brexit, we are truly reaching a golden era for uselessness. So let's look at Chris Grayling's career. As Justice Secretary, he banned books in prison, and his botched probation charges cost the taxpayer nearly £200 million in faulty contracts. And I would, in fact, like to commend Rory for the tremendous work, as Andrew said, that he's been doing at prisons for trying to sort out some of this mess. And usually, he would have been quietly shuffled off to the scene like that, given some report to write. But no, instead, he has graduated into the Champions League of Incompetence as Transport Secretary. Just last week, he had to pay out £33 million to Eurotunnel due to breaking procurement rules when he awarded a ferry contract to a company with no ships. He tried and failed to organise a mock traffic jam in Kent and ended up with 80 lorries trundling up and down a runway. Under his watch, Virgin Trains East Coast collapsed, leaving the taxpayer to pick up a tab of £2 billion. He's even gone international. The New York Times described him just last week as ushering in a golden age of political incompetence. In fact, there was a beautiful correction that they put beneath their story. It reads, "Because of an editing error, an earlier version of this article misstated the amount that Chris Grayling's misadventures are alleged to have cost British taxpayers. It is £2.7 billion, not £2.7 million. But what does this have to do with Brexit? Beyond giving Mr Grayling a new arena to waste our money in, his position has become unassailable due to his political background. As a long-standing Eurosceptic, yet also being fiercely loyal to Theresa May, he's been the benefit of Brexit affirmative action. He's become unsackable because he's one of the few Brexiters who will actually back Theresa May. These are the kinds of faulty incentives that we end up with under Brexit, and another reason that we need to bin this deal and bin the Brexit that this entails. And this still won't end if the deal passes. There will be so many more mediocrities elevated to ministerial positions because there are simply no one, not including you, Ron. Frankly, Theresa May is running out of people to appoint to ministerial posts because so many have resigned or spoken out vitriolically against her deal. This deal is no solution towards tackling the actual problems that this country faces. So ultimately, we shouldn't pretend that there are no other options, that it's this deal or no deal, whatever is inside these boxes. I don't think it's Noel Edmonds. Ultimately, if we deny choice to the British people on where they want to go from now, and if we tell them that this shoddy deal is in fact what they voted for, you will poison the well of British politics for a generation. Ultimately, the only way to avoid this rank is to have a national conversation, to bring this country together so that we can all decide where we want to go from now. We shouldn't give in to politicians who want to guard their prize of Brexit by issuing dark, unsubstantiated warnings about violence in the streets. Ultimately, there is division from forcing through a deeply unpopular deal that pleases no one. We have to do better. After all, as Nigel said in 2016, in a 52-48 referendum, this would be unfinished business by a long way. Theresa May said this morning that if her deal doesn't go through, we may well never leave the EU at all. That sounds pretty good to me. Thank you.